Madam Vice President, thank you so much for joining us on CGTN.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So let's start with your assessment of Chinese economy. It has recovered from the disruptions of the COVID pandemic and is expected to pick up again. What is your outlook on economic growth momentum in this year and beyond?
Thank you very much. So China is making a strong recovery, and we really see that in 2023. We could have a recovery with growth hovering around 5%. That is a very robust performance. That is really driven by consumption. Over time, we expect the Chinese economy to move more towards consumption. But we also see that services are reviving. In a way, all those sectors that are related to contact-intensive activities, like services, were very depressed by the pandemic. But this is a very positive development. Now, the world economy itself is not in as great a shape. You have less support from the world economy and therefore lower demand for the products that China produces. But the domestic economy is compensating a little bit for that. And as a result, we see a recovery which is good for China and good for everyone.
And China just wrapped up the policy setting 2 sessions. What topics do you pay the most attention to?
We pay a lot of attention to the direction of Chinese economic policy. We already started talking about the consumption side of the economy. We're also paying a lot of attention to the modernization of the economy, the reduction in inequalities, but also the ability of this economy to grow in a sustainable manner, both from the economic perspective, but also from the perspective of balance with the environment, with climate. And that is something that most countries in the world are now prioritizing, and that for China can actually be a source of future growth and of future jobs.
As you mentioned, China is pursuing modernization of the country, and the country is emphasizing on openness and inclusiveness to drive its future growth. What is your take on China's approach?
Those are very important goals. In a way, China is moving from decades of strong growth, which were able to bring millions and millions of Chinese out of poverty, but it's now focusing on high quality growth. And that means that growth will be more sustainable. It also means that it's trying to balance inequalities that exist in every economy in the world, but that in China reflect a little bit of a different performance between, say, coastal areas and more interior areas, between rural and urban, but also trying to balance this greening of the economy, which will take decades. It's a very difficult transition, because for all countries, really, not just for China, but they require really a transformation of the whole economy. And so this modernization has many facets, as well explained in all the documents that came out from the party meeting, and really require a concerted effort, both at the national level and at the local levels, to move in that direction of higher quality growth.
Indeed. And we have to admit that China is facing some challenges of its economy as it enters a crucial stage to transform into a higher income country. It now faces challenges such as slower growth and an aging society. And policymakers say that China needs to rebalance the economy towards domestic consumption and productivity growth. In your opinion, what should be the future drivers of China's economy?
You mentioned already productivity growth. We think that's going to be extremely important. China's in its first phases of development really invested in a growth that was driven by public and private investments, and that was the right thing to do at the time. But what we see over time is that the returns on the investment start declining over time. And productivity, in fact, has been declining over the past decade. What that means is that there's a need to move to a different pace of reforms that help the economy get more out of each unit of investment. That's what productivity is at the end of the day. And so those reforms in that direction will make a huge difference. And that requires real structural reforms that go at the incentives that the economy works with. But it also requires investing in policy frameworks that encourage both public and private sectors to go into greener activities. Those will be activities that use the natural resource base less intensively. So when we think about China's carbon intensity, meaning the units of emissions, carbon emissions that are produced out of each unit of output, it is pretty high. So that has to be brought down at the same time that the country develops. And there are already policies in that direction. And China actually made very ambitious commitments as part of their agreements on climate to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. This requires action already today to start driving that transformation. But all of these can be transformations that generate growth, generate jobs, and really modernize the economy towards a higher income status.
Mm. And China is very much committed to its dual carbon goals. In your opinion, what key reforms are needed to ensure that these the goals to reach carbon neutral by 2060 being achieved?
There are really actions at all levels of the economy and society, I would say. Let's start with the energy sector. So switching energy sources from fossil fuels that are more carbon intensive to more renewables, and China has really good technology already on the renewable side, will make a huge difference. This is an economy that still uses over 50% of coal to produce electricity. But there are other sectors as well: public transport, agriculture and land use, the way cities are managed can also be more or less carbon intensive. And all of those require also a change in how the private sector produces the goods that it produces and the services it produces. There are ways of bringing that carbon intensity down. But at the same time, like in the renewables sector, China can also turn that into a comparative advantage, where it produces technology, produces goods that can help itself, but also help others make that energy transition and that green transition.
And rural work is also one of the high priorities for the Chinese government, and China has stressed that we should not let the farmers falling back into poverty again. In your opinion, what can be done to ensure that?
I think I would relate that to the previous points I talked about. In a way, rural poverty too declined in China, and there were tremendous gains that were made in reducing poverty through better technologies, better practices, and really overall development and provision of public services in rural areas, and that brought many of the poor in rural areas up. One of the things that is going to be needed is to manage better the use of natural resources in rural areas. There are areas where we see some depletion in natural resources, productivity of the soil, also management of water. Now, some of them will want to move, so there's still a need to manage migration. This is a society that is aging, and so migration between different parts of the country and even internal and external is going to be necessary. And so ensuring that for migrants, they have access to public services would help even out and have some convergence between the growth and poverty reduction in rural areas versus urban centers that are driving much of the growth and poverty reduction in China.
.360-degree profiles of industry movers and shakers, tech mavericks, and policymakers. We drill down on their success. We ask how they set strategy and how they navigate in an increasingly competitive market. Real talk real business. Join the conversation. Biz Talk, only on CGTN.
I'd like to talk a bit about the Common Prosperity Goal, which is one of the important goals for China. In China, income inequality has declined but remains a concern. Could you share with us some experiences about how to make the economic growth more inclusive?
There's quite good experience around the world, really, about how to reduce inequality. Some of the best experience actually comes from Europe, and it is a mix of policies. Fiscal policy has a big role to play, both by providing similar opportunities to people to get a good education, high quality education, regardless of where they are born. And so having both a taxation system that is progressive, meaning it taxes more the wealthy and less the poor, but also having a property tax that also contributes to a more progressive taxation system. And on the expenditure side, having a set of expenditures that tries to contribute to equality of opportunities regardless of where you're born. Where you're born is luck in a way, but also some redistribution of benefits, social security, for example, or support for more vulnerable families to be able to maintain a good living. As part also of this greening of the economy, and so planning on that from the start and ensuring that fiscal policy is helping sustain those transfers of resources and labor across sectors. And at the end of the day, if we have an economy that is more consumption-based, because let's think in the future, these export demand that China used to grow so rapidly, that is going to slow down, at least in the short run. So that consumption side and the redistribution side all can work in the direction of both supporting a service sector that is creating jobs, but also contribute to reducing inequalities between different parts of the country and different families.
The one concern about common prosperity in China is it may discourage investment and entrepreneurship. In your opinion, how to maintain a very vibrant investment and private sector while achieving these goals towards equity?
The private sector is going to play a critical role in sustaining growth. There are very few countries that were able to sustain over the long run a strong growth performance, which then lifts people out of poverty and sustains them out of poverty, without a private sector that has confidence in the future of the country and in policy directions. What I heard in the last speeches from the government was a sense of policy continuity, continued opening up, and a relative adjustment here and there on inequality, modernization, stability, and environment and climate, which are going to be very critical. If those statements are then backed up by specific policy reforms that give the private sector that confidence, then we would be confident the private sector would stay and would expand.
Right. And we know World Bank is working closely with China to achieve some of China's key priorities. Help us understand what is World Bank planning in China this year and beyond towards sustainable recovery of the economy.
So the World Bank and China have a very long-standing and strong partnership, which has evolved and really into a two-way partnership. We provide analytical advice on specific reform, specific areas, but we also provide policy advice on specific issues that the government may request. At the same time, we also still provide financing for China's activities and implementation of key objectives that are shared both by China and by the World Bank. A lot of our work this year, next year, is focused on development problems, and we talked about rural development. That is a set of projects that we're working on, but doing it in a sustainable way. So that provides both benefits for China, but benefits for the world. And then the last point I would say, and that's something we benefit from the experience in China, is that China's development experience is some of the best in the world. And many developing countries aspire to learn from what China has achieved in many areas. So we too learn from China's experience. We convey that experience to other developing countries, and then China makes also a contribution to a fund called the International Development Agency, which is our fund to provide concessional cheap financing or grants to the poorest countries. Many years ago, China was a beneficiary of that fund when it was poorer, and now China has become the 6th largest contributor to that fund, and therefore that's also a way in which China is benefiting the world and also, I guess, paying back for what it has received many years ago. So really a two-way partnership that is robust, that is strong, and that is rooted on decades of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. What is your observation of China's ongoing financial reforms? Do you think it is effectively supporting China's transition and rebalancing towards some of its key goals?
I think that China is moving towards this more consumption-based economy that still exports, still has a big role on the world's value chains, but balances more the external demand with the domestic demand. And that has started, that rebalancing has started. At the same time, of course, China, like other countries, are balancing a recovery objective of getting growth back after the years of pandemic, which were difficult for everybody, and therefore managing this longer-term objectives with the short-term objectives of recovery are going to be critical. But I think that some of the reforms that China can launch now really will set foundations for the future. China is a country, I learned, always thinks very long-term, and this is time to also think long-term beyond the short-term recovery, and I'm very confident that it will do so.
I heard that one of the experts that China's unique feature of its growth is the combination of pragmatism and vision. I think both are very important for China. And I'd like to ask you one more question about China's role in regional and world economy. What contribution would you like China to play to the East Asia and Pacific, or the world economy as a whole?
Well, China has been a major source of exports for the world, especially manufacturing. It is also, because of its scale, it has a role in generating global demand. And until now, it has really contributed, especially on the export side. With this rebalancing towards consumption, it can perhaps play a bigger role on the demand side as well. And in this region, East Asian Pacific, for which I'm responsible, it is the main trading partner for many of these countries. Geography matters, and these value chains are very integrated with each other. So we can expect that recovery of the Chinese economy to also produce greater demand for neighboring countries. And at the same time, many of them will tell me, and they have told me, that they expect to see more Chinese tourists coming their way. That also makes a contribution in the region, given the scale of your country. And then finally, over time, again, given your scale, how China evolves towards this greener economy with lower carbon intensity, that will have an impact on the world and on climate. I think the major carbon emitters in the world all have a big role to play in helping to manage climate change and reduce it. And China, of course, with this level of growth and performance and emissions, also has a role to play.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
You know, China has committed to opening up further to the world economy. It has been underpinning China's economic success in the past several decades, the globalization, free trade, but it seems China is now facing some headwinds on that front. Are you confident that China can sustain its economic growth in the future given the more complex global environment?
It absolutely is a more difficult environment for a variety of reasons. I mentioned that the global economy is not as robust and not as strong. So the global economy is not as robust. At the same time, the geopolitics have become more complex. And that too plays a role in how trading partners relate with each other, how open markets are. And that also means that adds an additional element of complexity to the external environment. In that sense, China's policies to rebalance towards consumption, to enhance this competitiveness of their industries, of the service sector, are all things that will help its resilience, will help its competitiveness, and will help sustain the direction of modernization and prosperity that it set out for itself.
And meanwhile, China is also more actively involved in the world economy by increasing investment. China is a key player of the Belt and Road Initiative, and China also stressed on the shared prosperity with other countries. Do you welcome China's more engaging role in the regional and world economy?
I think developing countries need financing from a variety of places. So in that sense, everyone who contributes, public and private, who contributes financing and investment to developing countries that is in their interest, we support, of course. Now, I think there's one issue that is important, is that many developing countries, because of a variety of reasons, but including also the fact that they too were affected by the pandemic,
Yes.
Are struggling with high levels of debt. And all of us have a responsibility to address that. But in terms of contribution to developing countries, as I mentioned, China makes a strong contribution to the International Development Association, which provides concessional credits and grants to poor countries. All of those contributions from China make an impact on developing countries and help these countries make perhaps the same path that China made in succeeding in getting to this level of development. Not to say everything is resolved, but you're well on your way.
So the Asian and Pacific economies face some headwinds in recent years due to tightening financial conditions as the Fed raises rates to tackle the inflation, which is running at a very high level. What is your suggestions for these economies, especially emerging economies, to recover from these disruptions?
I think the pandemic, let's go back to the pandemic because it's at the root of many of these pressures, really generated supply disruptions, and we saw them here in the region. Although the region as a whole actually gained market share during the pandemic in terms of exports. But with all the support that went into households and businesses during the pandemic, came quite a lot of stimulus to the economy. There were commodity markets that were very severely disrupted. Grains in particular, but also oil and others. And that has added additional pressures to inflation. And so what we've seen in the past year and a half, 2 years, is really inflationary pressures with core inflation increasing in a large number of economies. It started in the US and in Europe, but it has spread And in many countries in this region, not China, but in many countries in this region, we now see inflationary pressures quite strong. In China, you have more policy space because your inflation has stayed low and your fiscal policy still has a bit of space. You have some pressures on the financial sector due to real estate, but at the end of the day, and quite a bit of indebtedness on the real estate developer side, but overall you have some policy space to manage. This pandemic threw all policymakers into a territory they were not used to. And so many of these policies are being tested and effects seen with a lag. And we're starting to see, in some countries, a reduction in core inflation. In others, it's a bit more stubborn. We also don't know how the Ukraine situation will resolve itself. And so if it lasts long, it will add instability. If it is resolved in a satisfactory manner, then it can bring these tensions down and help contribute to price stability and therefore less tightening needed. But that's something that I would say China so far has been spared that inflationary pressure. So you have a bit more space.
What advantages do you think China should build on in the future?
I think everything that has to do with an innovation economy. And you see it already in some aspects of renewable energy, and you could see it in others. There's quite a few areas in which this engineering intensive, knowledge intensive economy can benefit from. And that is a source of future growth that can also help China achieve its climate objectives and statements, and can also even be produced out of more interior areas of the country, right? You don't need to be next to a port necessarily if you export software, right? You can be anywhere. So that sort of direction allows the country to put together several objectives: the common prosperity, the inequality reduction, the sophistication and going up the value chain in terms of value added, but also a more innovation-driven economy, right? And with this rebalancing of doing less of hard investment, infrastructure investment, which has sort of runs its course, and more into this direction that can help you also boost productivity of the economy-wide, right? So it has cross-cutting effects as well, and could help maintain your competitiveness in the future, now switching into these higher value-added activities.
Madam Vice President, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.